Ageism is pervasive. It can affect young people and later morph into something quite different as we grow older. Some will see glimmers of this in their 30s or 40s, but its impact increases over the decades, particularly when combined with the physical changes that impact many in the process of growing older. In many ways, our society has become so afraid of what the future may look like that we segregate older people, often by sending them to nursing homes that operate as institutions and have no connection to the local community. Most of us will not end up in long-term care, and yet segregation still exists within the community through societal perceptions, creating a profound sense of otherness that can lead to depression, or as some studies say, an early death. All of this matters because Canada is fast becoming a super age country when in early 2030s, 1 in 4 will be over the age of 65. But aging is not just the milieu of the boomer generation. The eldest in the massive cohort of millennials will start turning 50 in the early 2030s. And next year, Generation X will start turning 60. We use the word ageism, but most of us don't know its breadth and depth, nor how deeply it impacts society. That is the focus of today's panel, although I suspect our conversation will take us to many interesting places. So let's start with a quick question for our panelists, but this is also a question for you in the audience, one that we hope you can ponder as we spend the next hour together. And feel free to add your insights into the chat section and share them with us. So the question is this, and I'll go to Samir first, who I believe is the youngest on the panel. Do you consider yourself part of the aging population? Let's just do this in 30 seconds or less.
Absolutely.
Samir?
Right from day one, you're aging. So we're all parts of the aging population.
Tracey?
Couldn't have said it any better. There's no such thing as someone who is not aging. Aging is about all of us.
And Mary?
Of course, we're all aging. Of course, we're all aging. It starts from birth. We don't necessarily realize that we're aging, but we are definitely doing that. So it's, yes, the minute we make that 1 minute mark when we're born, that's it. We're aging.
That's all excellent points. And I think that was the point to be made, that a lot of us recognize that fact, that we are all aging as we go through life, no matter what stage you're in. Tracey, in the preface of your book, you wrote, "Everything you know about aging is wrong. It's not your fault." You said it is important to understand the history of ageism in order to better understand how ageism and ableism are endemic in our culture. I recommend people pick up your compelling book, but can you give us a concise explanation of that history and describe why it is so important to know the origins of ageism and ableism in order to understand where we are today?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Moira. That's such a great question to get us started. I think it all begins with the fact that aging itself is something that we misunderstand. So we tend to see aging in a couple of different ways. We tend to see it as something that happens to other people, and that speaks to your first question, who considers themselves part of the aging population. When we disassociate with our own aging, that's clearly going to feed ageism. And the second is seeing aging as just a process of decline. And when you think about the history, you go back all the way even to biblical references, and you see kind of two different stories about aging. One in which it's really focused on a process of biological change and decline, and even from very early references, starting to figure out how we fight that decline. And then the other is talking about elders in terms of reverence. So we've had a story that includes kind of contradictory pieces to it, really from the beginning of our time, from the beginning of our history that we know of. And that adds to the complexity of ageism today. When you add in things like the rise of the Industrial Revolution and technology and globalism and the way that we connect with each other now, the story of ageism gets more and more complex. It's going to continue to change, as you pointed out so relevantly, because we're going to have more older people for the first time in history than younger people. As we continue to see these demographic shifts, we're going to have to explore even more about how we value older people and how we provide opportunities for older people. So it's very nuanced, it's very layered. I'll say very quickly, ableism plays a role in it as well. When we see aging as a process of decline, it leads us to fear our future decline, and that makes us fear our future aging. So it's layered and it's nuanced.
How do you think, based on the history that you just described to us, if we knew more about that, how do you think that would alter our way of thinking about growing older and what's ahead?
I think awareness is the first part to changing our attitudes. And then when we change our attitudes, we can change our actions. So we first need to even understand, how do we learn about aging? Where do we have role models for what it means to be old? How do we think about our own aging? What fears are we carrying around? Recognizing that we do have loss as we get older, but we also continue to grow. We are always growing and becoming new versions of ourselves. If we focus on that, then we can contextualize that within the losses that we experience. Because the truth is, we experience loss throughout our lives, not just when we're older. We're constantly re-envisioning ourselves. So I think that the awareness raising is the first part to us then rewiring how we relate to our own aging and how we talk about it and the actions we take.
That's so interesting. Mary, you've given a lot of thought and advocacy to these very issues over the years. How have you experienced ageism? Can you give us an example of what you might have seen and how it impacted you?
I think ageism is a very complex idea, because sometimes we look at ageism as only doing things that are hurtful to people or harmful in themselves. But there's also the other side of ageism, where we look at someone and think, oh, they must need help crossing the street. Oh, they must need help doing things. I've told people, for instance, that I'm going on a trip. Oh, who are you going with? Who's going to help you? Well, why do I necessarily need help? I might have needed help even in my 20s. They don't necessarily think of a younger person as also needing help. And I find when I've had issues with my own frailty, like for instance, when I had some serious knee issues before I had the surgery, and I had to look for the closest elevator in order to get from one place to another, I felt old. I felt frail. I felt, oh, this is decline. This is terrible. And so there's also self-ageism. And I think one of the things that hasn't been mentioned yet, but is definitely something I know that's been expressed before, is that we are taught ageism from a very young age. Every commercial, every ad has something like this. There's ageism all around us. There was an ad on the TV that says this thing. There's this thing called age, and it sucks. And that was a commercial for a product for I think it was for knees or arthritic conditions. So when that's something you hear, that age sucks. Well, age doesn't necessarily suck. Yes, age is not necessarily great all the time, but it doesn't necessarily suck. If I can, can I give a quote? Because I come across something very recently from Rumi, and it's Rumi's the Sufi mystic poet from the 1300s. So this is not something new. Why must the tree's yellowing leaves indicate old age and uselessness? Why can't they signify maturity and wholeness? So this is something from back that many years ago. And so this is not something new. It's not like I hear people sometimes saying, oh, in the old days, everybody respected their elders. Oh, in the old days, it was great. Grandma lived at home and we all loved her and we didn't put her away in an institution. And aren't we so evil now? And we were so good before. Not necessarily. So ageism is pervasive, but it's something we need to deal with all the time. It's something that we need to look at in terms of what can we do so we're not thinking in an ageist way. Because I find myself sometimes feeling that way. I was driving the other day and I was walking and came across some people driving who stopped unneedlessly for a light. And I thought, oh, and I looked and sure enough, older people. And my first thought was, older people. And that's terrible. That might have been a 20-year-old. Would I have said, oh, 20-year-olds? So it's so pervasive. It's everywhere.
That's such an interesting perspective and illuminating as well. Samir, you have spent your career working with older adults, and with Tracey's explanation of the origins of ageism as the backdrop, what does ageism mean to you, particularly from a medical perspective? And for example, we've spoken in the past about the term unreliable historian, which was applied to a woman with cognitive decline. What have you seen on a regular basis, and how do you deal with these issues?
Well, I think this is where you see this, all of what we've just been talking about. You see it manifesting it in so many different aspects of our lives. And just one aspect, especially as we get older, you'll see a lot of ageism occurring within healthcare settings, because as we get older, I always just say to my patients, you experience more mileage, so you're going to have more encounters with the healthcare system. But this is where kind of what Tracey and what Mary were explaining kind of comes to a head, where, if a person, for example, is in a wheelchair, for example, are people talking over to them? Often, they'll even just the positioning that you see in conversations, where if there's, say, an older person who comes and their family member, their daughter or son is with them, you sometimes see people just naturally gravitate and have a conversation, with, the son or daughter, and just, assuming that older person can't speak for themselves. And just this idea of, can they even contribute? They're here, and they're a problem, and we've got to fix them, and they're in decline. And so you see a lot of this happening, and a lot of these ageist attitudes that manifest, where all of a sudden, you see people getting denied care, or even that self-ageism that, kind of, I'm often arguing with some of my 90-year-olds who are convinced that nobody would ever operate on a 90-year-old. And I have to take out the textbook of geriatric surgery, where I wrote the introductory chapter many moons ago. And I always love to show them this study of thousands of centenarians who had knee replacements and did incredibly well. And they're like, people would operate on someone that old, like, they would help. So you just see a lot of ageism, within healthcare. And what's sad about it is I spend a lot of time having to kind of almost deprogram, learned habits, or deeply ingrained habits, or habits that get reinforced, and try to, kind of make sure that our healthcare colleagues are really looking at the whole person, looking to them first, and not seeing them as not seeing them as a problem, but seeing this as a person first and foremost who needs help and care. And I'll just finish with, during the COVID pandemic, I remember there are two moments where you really saw kind of, I think, how Tracey kind of looked at this view of aging. I remember the premier of Alberta had said in the legislature there that the average person dying of COVID is about 2 years older than the average life expectancy of an Albertan. So this is not really a big problem, as if, it's killing, really old people, and they're past their best before dates. So it's fine. There was that. And then I remember I was moved to tears when there was a chief of an Indigenous community in the Yukon Territory who's being interviewed on national radio. And they said, look, your community has basically all gone into quarantine because there's 2 cases of COVID in your community. And he said, why are you doing this? And he said, because our elders are like libraries, and if we lose an elder, we lose an entire library. And it was that view of these elders, these folks as knowledge keepers and precious resources, that really kind of thought in a healthcare situation, one way where you think of older people as disposable, and another thing as our most valued treasures. And just really, as Tracey was describing, you see that real dichotomy that we exist in, and one that we need to really recalibrate.
Oh, that's so profound. Tracey, building on what Samir just said, one way to overcome ageism is to understand the fears that are fed to us about growing older and less powerful. And we saw those during the pandemic in so many different ways. And you write about the ways that ableism impacts our views on older adults. everyone will experience changes as they grow older, but what do you ascribe to our desire to look away from people with frailties? Is it a reminder of what might be coming for us? Is it our fear of death?
Yeah, oh, there's so many layers to it. And I think this builds off of both of the answers from Mary and Samir. You know, when we think about, first of all, how we learn about aging, and Mary really referred to that, it's if we don't have early role models for what it means to age, we're learning about it from the media, we're learning about it from a very skewed perspective. And of course, that's going to feed our fears of aging. If we see depictions of older people as scary, as frail, as demented, you know, that obviously is going to promote a future fear. And when the people in our own lives use language like, you know, as Mary said, don't get old, it sucks. That also is not, you know, giving a pathway for us to embrace what lies ahead, but rather to fear what lies ahead. So I think we've culturally really set it up that way. And one of the important things for us to remember is there are people that benefit from ageism. There are people that make billions of dollars from ageism. The fact that we have a thriving anti-aging industry that feeds us the narrative that we need to look, act, feel younger in order to be successful, even as an older person, is very powerful. And those are forces that shape our understanding of aging. So those are some of the elements. I absolutely believe fear of death plays a role in it as well. I think, as Samir was talking about, the fact that older people are undervalued, the fact that we do have like this pathology of dying, really turns people away from careers as geriatricians, from careers working with older people. The fact that, you know, many of them, at least in the States, they don't make as much money because it's undervalued. So all of these things make us push it away and make us want to other from older people. So I think there's so many reasons.
And to build on that, there's, you know, there is this, I think, need for us to recognize our fear of death, and as you just spoke about, and our turning away of people. But how do you sort of combine that piece of it with a need perhaps for some of us to really build for a future as a strong older adult, to, you know, try to protect our bone density and be, you know, our mobility, so we hopefully can avoid some of those falls that lead to such a decline among so many frailer older people. How do you sort of send the message like not to fear growing older, and yet at the same time prepare for it?
That's such a good question. And I see it on a continuum. You know, fear and anxiety exists on a continuum. Some of the good fear that we have can manifest into those proactive behaviors. So I want to live a long life. I'm going to try and take care of myself as best as I can. I'm going to exercise. I'm going to eat well. That's all kind of, you know, good fear in terms of making us have good, healthy behaviors. But then it can tip over into unproductive fear, where, you know, we're carrying around excess stress, where we're really trying to feel this sense of dread and trepidation about our future. That ends up being not healthy for us, and then it tips the scales the other way. So we have a ton of research that shows when we carry around that level of stress and fear about aging, we're actually more likely to manifest negative health outcomes. So it's trying to find that sweet spot of, I want to take care of myself, I want to invest in myself, but I can also see a future me that I can look forward to. And it's just trying to find that somewhere in the middle.
Mary, it sounds like you may have found that balance. You're going for a good long hike in Spain this year, I understand. And I'm really interested in your thoughts as a woman on older women. And what do you want, if I may ask, younger women to know about the experience of an older woman?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned specifically women, because one of the things I've just told someone just this week when I was speaking to a friend of mine who's in her 30s, that she should look forward to menopause, that actually there's the freedom that comes with aging, and having that behind you, and that it's something to look forward to. And she said she hadn't thought of that, like it was just, you just hear about the bad stuff. You don't hear about the fact that you're now free of certain things that were oppressive before. And also, as an older woman, you face a double discrimination, because there's ageism and the fact that women also, I was just reading something that just came, I think, from the Lancet or whatever, that women's health actually suffers from discrimination in the medical field. So you've got discrimination based on your age, you've got discrimination based on the fact that you're a woman. So there's that to be thought. Plus, of course, for some people, there's many other identities that also will impact how people look at you. But aging with thought, to thinking of how you can actually live now, and how you actually, by having a good feeling about your aging, will actually impact your age. You actually age healthier when you feel good about yourself. I mean, researchers have found that. So there's nothing to be gained by going, oh, this hurts, that hurts, I have pain here and there. Well, what about all the rest of you? Like, if I spent my whole day thinking about the little aches and pains that are constant, I would spend my whole day thinking about the little aches and pains that are constant. Whereas if I get out there and I'm walking or I'm doing something, I've got other things on my mind. If I'm at a meeting and talking with other people, I've got other things on my mind. If I'm going to listen to a podcast, I've got other things on my mind. And I'm not thinking about, oh, woe is me, I'm getting older, I'm getting older, I'm getting older. It's a problem I actually have with some of the things we do for older people. When we have senior centers and people go to the senior center, and if that becomes your whole frame of reference, me and older people, you don't see that there's more out there, that you can actually be connected to younger people and be teaching them without teaching. I mean, it's not like, oh, I'm going to teach you what it's like to be old, but you tell them things and they go, oh, I didn't know that. I didn't think of that. You're right. You tell them about history. I mean, the history they have is in a book, or it's on a podcast, or it's on a TV. I think about all the people that I have seen on, for instance, TV shows that are now long gone, that are only now like a distant memory. I can remember all sorts of events because I lived them. I remember what it was like when the Beatles came to town. I remember things like that. It's not just something that I would watch. And that's something I can explain to younger people. I can tell them what it was like, what it felt like. You can't get that from just watching something. So we have so much to share with younger people. If I were God and I was going to be creating the school system, I would actually be teaching about aging right from kindergarten. Teaching about brain health, teaching about things people can do to have as healthy a life as possible. There's so much we can do, but we're not doing because we're just spending our time moaning and groaning about how terrible life is and how bad it is and how in the old days everything was peachy. In the old days, we didn't come into, we played outside until the lights went on. Well, yeah, maybe. There were other things too. So the present is not so terrible and the future is not necessarily terrible. And yes, I worry about death and dying, but what am I going to do about it? I can't make it go away. It's going to happen. So that's my few cents.
I also want to follow up with you on women again, the question, because number-wise, statistically, there are far more women living alone than there are men at a certain age. And that can be because in many ways, men die somewhat earlier than women. What have you seen related to that, to the issue of loneliness? That's a topic that a lot of people are discussing right now, and with a focus on and the older woman's experience. So what are your thoughts on that piece of it? And how do people sort of take what you said in your previous answer, which is to focus more on life? How do people take that when they're and move forward with that when there's such a large number of people who are potentially isolated?
Well, I think one of the problems is that we tend to have our friends and acquaintances from people in our own age mate. So we tend to grow up with certain people and they tend to be our close friends and we hang with them and we have a lot to share with each other. And so little by little, they die. They might be people who are very close to us, like a spouse or a very close friend or a close relative, but they also can be the distant cousin, the distant people, the people you went to school with that you keep up a correspondence with once a year, and now they're gone. But if you are actually looking to sort of strengthen your social connections, you should also be looking at people who are younger than you. One of the reasons I went back to school, and when I turned 65, I decided to go back to university as an undergraduate. Even though I already had a graduate degree, I went back as an undergraduate to take courses, mostly so I could be around younger people and be able to talk to younger people on something where we would be equal, because I would be learning something new, they would be learning something new, and we could share the experience. And I could see how younger people think, I could understand better how they felt, and I would become actually less ageist, because there's also the ageism against the youth too. So I definitely think one of the things we need to encourage, especially women, because we tend to be the one who's been looking after everybody, and then we're the last one standing. Sorry. Oh, I was gonna say, we're usually the last one standing. And so we then sort of are all alone, and we're all alone in our oldest ages, and when we don't really have the ability to be supportive to everybody else. So I think it's important not to wait till that point. And we
That's
need to
very
worry
good
about our
insight.
caregivers, because our caregivers tend to become more isolated because they're spending so much of their energy and time in their caring roles. And I know many women, but not many, I know some women who have looked after a spouse, and then the spouse died. Then they've looked after a sibling, and that sibling died. Then they've looked after a friend, and that friend died. Now they're all alone. They have no one to look after them. And they have not been able to make acquaintances and make friends and get out there, even with their old friends, because they've been so busy concentrating. And the few minutes they've had when there's been a caretaker coming in is they rest, or they go grocery shopping, or they do something that's not conducive to social engagement. So we need to give our caregivers the opportunity to be out there besides the caregiving, especially when we keep saying, oh, you'll leave the hospital early and there'll be someone at home who will help you with that. Like,
Those
who's
are
your
really
carer?
good
Who's your
points,
carer?
Mary.
They're always asking, who's your carer? Who's
Mhm.
going to help you? Always
Mhm.
someone's who's going to help you. Well, there may not be someone to help you. So, like, instead of waiting till that happens, let's get out there.
Excellent points. And it really does show the stories that we've all heard of people being isolated. My next question is for Tracey and Samir, and I'm just going to go back a little bit to in part to an earlier conversation about the pandemic, which was when we really saw ageism at its highest, watching resources flow to hospitals while thousands of people living in nursing homes died, especially in those tiny old homes that were decades old with no upgrades. And one could argue that the nursing home staff, mostly racialized women who got COVID and sometimes died, were the collateral damage from that ageism. And we saw references to Boomer Remover on Twitter. And there was a lot of grief that was spread around among different groups and different ages during that time period. Do you think that the exposure to these beliefs has led or will lead to a new awareness about ageism, or have we all just moved on? And I'll ask Samir first.
It's a great question, Moira, because I think, as you said, right, throughout the pandemic, we started realizing very quickly that this was a virus that really it zoned in really on older people, where you just saw that I think over 90% of the folks who died in Canada from COVID-19 thus far have been older adults. So this is really, and when that started happening, you almost start seeing a society that at a start was very unified, because everyone was scared because we don't know who's in the line of fire. Then you start seeing, oh, it's the older people who are in the line of fire, not so much the younger people. And so all of a sudden, they should isolate themselves. They should, stay behind walls so that the rest of us can get on with our lives. And you just see these layers in the Boomer Remover. Remember when that was, circulating on social media? So it was quite interesting. But But I also thought that what it did galvanize, I think, a lot of public opinion. We did some polling through our National Institute on Aging, was looking at how Canadians were looking at places like long-term care homes. And what we really saw was that about 40% of Canadians had said they had changed their minds as to whether they'd ever consider living themselves or having a loved one move into a retirement home or a nursing home, because these were ground zero of some of the worst tragedies that we saw during the pandemic. And so I think a lot of people started kind of facing some of these aspects that, wow, we never really cared about these people. We warehouse them in these poor quality facilities. We don't value adjacent individuals who are caring professionals working with older people. So they're some of the worst paid, often in situations with poor benefits and other things. And so all of a sudden, I think people became aware of maybe some of the societal consequences of ageism that way. Now, has that changed our views? I don't think it's really, made us kind of say, we're now going to do much more to protect older people. I think politicians were very good at saying never again, never again. But, actions speak louder than words. And when you start looking about how we fundamentally change the system, we haven't. We're trying to build that tens of thousands of new beds in Ontario right now with pre-pandemic design standards, for example. So have we really learned anything? I think we've learned some things. I think, if anything, I think people are now a bit more fearful about their future and how they're going to age. But I'm also hoping that there have been some bright lights where people do know about how vulnerable older populations can be, and how there is an opportunity for us to do more as a society.
And Tracey, what are your thoughts? Do you think that we've moved forward in a positive way at all? Or do you think we're sort of treading water here with our philosophies because of what we've seen through the pandemic?
I think, Samir really, wrapped it very nicely. I think there are some bright spots and bright sides. I will say, as an ageism advocate and researcher, more people are aware of what ageism is, at least kind of on a surface level, because we were talking about it a whole lot more. So it certainly gained more global attention. Before that, people were like, ageism's not a thing. What are you talking about? And then, you had examples to say it's everywhere in the media. So in that way, it kind of helped raise awareness and helped kind of spur on the conversation. And for that, I am grateful, because we have more opportunities like this, where we can really kind of dissect it in a little bit more depth and really talk about its impacts with people. But I also agree with Samir that we have a really long way to go, and we haven't solved the systemic problems whatsoever that led to so much of the tragedy that happened during the COVID pandemic. It's always interesting to me that we think of congregate living long-term care as a default for older people, when the vast majority of older people don't have any intention or desire to live in that kind of community. As Mary was saying, the actual best thing that we can do for humanity as a whole is have people of different ages organically develop relationships and share life experiences with each other. And then if you look at the second layer, as again, Samir was saying, about how we not only devalue older people, but those that care for them. And that was very resonant during the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And people who worked in those facilities, we might call them heroes, but it might be nicer if they just felt valued and got paid a living wage and could work in one facility rather than having to bop around to a million of them. So, yes, we've learned from it. I hope we will do more than just learn from it and actually put some policy in place to support it. But I've seen little bits, but I haven't seen a whole mass movement to do that.
Let's speak about intergenerational connections then, because as everyone has now noted, they're very, very important to the well-being of all of us. And Tracey, I'll ask you this question as well. In the Netherlands, there is a retirement home where students also live, getting free rent in return for what is called their community spirit. And the outcome is that many young people have said they realize that older people are not any different than they are. And actually, as Mary noted, these students have said that they have a really good grasp of history because they've lived through it. And so the younger people have learned a lot from them. And so for many, it's been a mind expanding experience. And on an entirely different note, one of the studies published by the National Institute on Aging with Samir looked at retirement savings and found that a great many people believe they will have to keep working well past their so-called retirement years to survive these inflationary times. And this appears to be an ongoing problem that could potentially lead to a lot of older adults remaining in the workforce for an extended period. So given the success of the intergenerational experiences, do you see the possibility that these financially challenging times could actually enable all generations to connect in ways that could help eliminate ageism on both ends of the spectrum because they would essentially be working and spending time together?
I think that is a great question. And yes, I do. I think I like your question for many reasons. Mary alluded to earlier that ageism goes both ways. So ageism is omnidirectional. It's towards older people. It's also towards younger people. It's anytime we make an assumption or a judgment about someone based on age. And we do see this directed towards younger people quite a bit. So research has showed us that if you have age diverse teams in the workplace, they are found to be more productive than having teams that are, using age as an affinity. So we already know that there is a model for this intergenerational engagement in the workplace and beyond that works really well. When people of all ages spend time together and realize that they have more in common with each other than they were first thought to believe, and that they can teach each other things, think reciprocal mentoring, younger people teaching older people teaching younger people. When it all comes together and we're sharing our skills, that really is quite beneficial. But economic times are changing, and there's actually going to be an economic imperative for older people to work longer. Because we're having this demographic shift and we're going to have more older people than younger people, we're going to need older people to stay in the workplace, as many of them are going to want to stay in the workplace. For many people, it gives them purpose and it gives them meaning. Then there's going to be people that can't afford to retire. So the landscape is changing, very, very much so. For us to be prepared and ahead and start to think about age diversity within organizations, within communities, to start teaching about age bias and ableism and how it plays out within the workplace is actually a real imperative right now to prepare us for the next decade, where we're going to naturally see this kind of happen in real time. So yes, intergenerational connections, I think, is going to be absolutely key.
And Samir, to build on that, then as a society, we are often limited by our fear of aging, as we've all just discussed. But let's talk about the positives then. And Tracey has set out the intergenerational benefits quite eloquently, but what are you seeing from perhaps a medical and emotional perspective among your patients? What do we have to look forward to?
Yeah, when we think about ageism and how it's become such a big issue, I think, it's been around, as Tracey was saying, since time began, if you will. As we started aging, we started to become ageist, I guess, as well. But, I always remind people that if you were born in Canada in 1900, your life expectancy was 51 years of age. I think it was 47 in the United States. Tracey will correct me. Now, we're living, to our late 70s or early 80s. And so when people say, what was the greatest accomplishment of the last century? I don't think it was that we put a person on the moon. I think it's that we almost doubled our life expectancies. So we now have more people living longer than ever before. Moira, it's the name of your project, the third act. I call it the longevity dividend, right? The idea that people, Mary, you were never supposed to live this long. And not only did you have a career, but then you were able to do additional degrees beyond the original degrees you did. You're now going to go and discover Spain. Maybe you didn't get time to do that before. There's the dividend that you get that you look forward to. There's that opportunity to be able to grow and develop and learn more. And I love spending time with my older patients, because as they just get older and older, they're just more confident. They know what they want. And they know, they've lived life. They have so much experience that I actually get excited about aging, because I'm like, I'm going to be so much more cool, calm, and collected. I'm going to know more things, as I get older and older, because I'm going to have more time to learn, more time to do things. I'm getting excited about when I retire and all the things that I'm going to do, from that perspective. So it's amazing if we can reframe the way we think about these things. But the challenge is I think, again, there's so many things that we put in our ways. And I think part of it is, I have an intergenerational experience every day, because I work with older patients, and I happen to be almost half their age most of the time. So that's kind of fun. And so I get that benefit. But where I've seen countries or organizations that can actually build in those intergenerational mechanisms. So not just kind of from a healthcare perspective, but from a societal perspective. I've seen some beautiful examples in Denmark. There was one we filmed for CBC when we visited the House of the Generations, which was a purpose-built, kind of 400-unit tower in the middle of a tower development, if you will. But they had people of all ages living, and people intentionally were moving into this intergenerational community. And I remember one of the most moving moments was when, about four in the afternoon, all of a sudden I heard a lot of noise in the main area on the ground floor. They had this big atrium, and all of a sudden all these kids and their teachers were forming a circle, and then all the elders were gathering around outside the circle, and then they started singing and the kids were dancing, and I'm like, what's going on here? This looks amazing. And it was really interesting, because I said, what are they singing? It was all in Danish. And they said, well, they're singing nursery rhymes. And I'm like, oh, that's cool. And I'm like, well, why are the elders, what's going on here? And the elders were there because they were singing the nursery rhymes because they felt their job was to help teach the nursery rhymes. They were teaching children these songs, but they were getting social connections. They were building friendships. And in this intentional community, now you see each other in different ways. You're forming bonds. It was just amazing when you could see these opportunities where housing that creates those intergenerational relationships, mentoring programs in schools where you bring older adults who might have some time and want to mentor younger students, and you create those intergenerational opportunities. Home sharing is another amazing opportunity where you have spare bedrooms because the children have grown up and they've moved out. You want to stay in your home, and just like you talked about, Moira, that retirement home in the Netherlands, like we have 5 million empty bedrooms in the Greater Toronto area right now. That could solve the housing crisis tomorrow for so many people, and create an incredible intergenerational opportunity that breaks down those barriers and those opportunities, and gets more people excited about aging, like the way I am as well. So I think these are just some of the things I look at it from a number of the perspectives, but I think there is a lot to look forward to. It's sad to me that a lot of people don't look at aging that way. But, as Tracey was saying, there's a lot of people with a vested interest to make me want to fear aging. So I'll go buy some face creams and get some surgery or something else, which, not for me.
Those are great stories. And that builds to my final question then before we go to the viewer questions. So we just have a couple moments, Mary. But what would you say, or how do you see the happiness curve that for many older adults arrives in our later years?
You mean like, I'm not sure I understand your question.
There's a belief that as we grow older, we see things differently. Perhaps there's less stress in our lives, and there's something that people would refer to as a happiness curve that comes with age, with older age, so to speak. And just sort of to build off what Samir was saying about there's much to look forward to. Do you have thoughts on happiness just in general then over dominating your world over the fear that some people have?
I think partly it starts much younger than old age. So I think if you think of old age as doom and gloom from when you're young, and I mean really young, then you're more likely to continue seeing it as doom and gloom as you age, because there will be things that happen. But I think that as you see it as freedom, as you see it as a chance to continue to grow, that you haven't stopped growing, that it's now, I mean, I always got upset when I heard about things called senescence. Everything's going to slow down and head towards death. And there's this downhill curve, and you're on that slope, and bye-bye, there you go down to the bottom. Well, it's more like a rocky road that is gradually going into decline. But there are so many high points that you can have along the way, and you can make it last longer. You don't know when you're going to die, but you can make that time you have left to be at the high point and not at the bottom point. And a lot of it has to do with how you live your life. And it's not a question of, oh, I have no aches and pains, I have no morbidities, I have no medical conditions. No, you live with them and you make your life as good as possible. And you live with them and you continue to grow emotionally, you continue to grow socially, you continue to have new acquaintances, new experiences, and you live for that, as opposed to just simply living for, oh, I'm going to die and I'm declining, and that's the end. It's going to happen, but you can make this part a lot longer than this part by how you live your life. And so, yes, there's decline, but it does not have to be downhill. So I think attitude has a lot to do with it, and how you, if you are lucky, because if you have a whole life, like even through your work life, through your social life, that's nothing but hard work, no time for yourself, no time to have fun, no time to do anything except struggle, then it's going to be much more difficult for you to have a good life. I mean, we were all talking here. I don't think any of us on this panel is wondering where the next meal is coming from. So we can have the time and the energy to age as well as possible. But people who are struggling to find where the next meal is coming from, when you see that seniors are now having to leave their homes because they can't afford the new rents, those people cannot just say, oh, I'm so looking forward to tomorrow. So we need to find ways to make life as good as possible for as many people as possible, as long as possible.